Hey guys, this is Fight Commentary Breakdown aka Jerry, and we have Alex Richter from Kung Fu Genius, who I've been following for a long time, and I love listening to his stories. So, dude, Sifu, welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a huge honor, and I've loved your videos as well.
Thank you, thank you. So, a lot of you guys, one of the videos that I saw of Alex's that really got me to want to talk to him was when he talked about that Fight Quest episode with Wing Chun and how the stupid execs were like, no, we don't want him. It's just like I heard that I was like, wow, that just like it defines the ignorance when it comes to martial arts sometimes. It's like people have to appropriate certain roles and certain things for certain people, and it just makes me angry. And a funny segue was that I was watching Olympic Taekwondo because the Olympics are going on in Tokyo. And again, there's a lot of legit Taekwondo, but wow, you look at Olympic Taekwondo in the Olympic level, and they're literally playing bad fencing sideways stance with their feet. It looks disgusting. It's not even a martial art anymore. It just pisses me off.
Absolutely. And I did Taekwondo when I was a teenager from World Taekwondo Federation, which is the same one that goes to the Olympics. And I looked at that too, and I was like, that's not how we used to do it back in the day. I mean, it's like a very odd game of tag with the
Yeah,
foot, and it's like almost has very little to do with traditional martial arts practice.
yeah, and I remember them. I'll probably, sometimes I tell stories on my channel, right? In-depth stories, but I sparred a Taekwondo guy back in the day, a WT Taekwondo also, and I was like, whoa, he's kicking me from everywhere. Like, this is a guy who sparred, right? He wasn't playing foot tag with me. Like, I was going in, he was kicking me back, and like his kicks had a lot of, follow through to it. So, like, then
Right.
compared to what we're seeing now in the Olympics.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, anyways, now that I got that rant off my chest, let's talk a little bit about Kung Fu. Let's talk about Wing Chun. I'm sure if people go to Kung Fu Genius, they'll see more of your story, but let's briefly talk about it. So, how did you get into Kung Fu and martial arts?
So I started, I'm a child of the 80s, so my influence is different. I think most of the kids who grew up nowadays probably see MMA first, but if you grew up in the 80s, you saw either martial art films or you saw karate or something like that. And for me, I got bullied by a next door neighbor. He actually knocked out one of my teeth when he refused to give me one of my toys back. And I was floored. I couldn't do anything. I was so angry. The movie Karate Kid had recently come out. I asked my mom to sign me up for karate lessons, which she did right away. I didn't do it because of an overwhelming need to, like, wasn't in love with martial arts. I just want to learn to defend myself so no one would do that to me again.
Yeah.
And eventually came back. I actually punched that guy back in the face like a few weeks later. And the funny thing is, he ended up joining the karate school. We ended up being friends later. So it's like one of those, when you're kids, one week you're enemies, the next week you're friends kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And very shortly after that, I think it was about 8 or maybe even 9 years old, I was homesick from school one day, and my dad went to the video store and brought back the movie Enter the Dragon, which is like, in hindsight, maybe not the most age appropriate movie for an 8 or 9 year old, but hey, my dad's from Germany. He was way, way more relaxed about those kind of things. And I saw Bruce Lee, and I was like, what is this?
Yeah.
Because it was just such a different presentation from what I was used to seeing in my karate school, and there was just something about him and his, and his body and his physique and how cool he was and everything. And that movie changed my whole life path. And I used to read martial art magazines. My parents would buy me Inside Kung Fu and Black Belt magazine every month, and I would read them from cover to cover. And I would read about Bruce Lee and about all the different martial arts styles, and Chinese martial arts really caught my eye, but there were no Chinese Kung Fu schools in New Jersey at that time. So I had to continue with karate and then later Taekwondo. And it wasn't until I was 15 years old and we moved to Seattle that I was able to start learning Wing Chun out there. And, but yeah, I was kind of a typical, did karate and Taekwondo first, which is a very typical story here in the States. It took a while before I could start doing Chinese Kung Fu.
Wow. It's really interesting hearing your story because for me, most I hear a lot of martial artists. They get into martial arts because they had one or two incidents of bullying, or a kid bullied them. And I think back to my life, right? And the only kind of bully I had when I was really little was the next door neighbor. Kind of like you said, you had a next door neighbor too. But
Sure.
the thing is, I was so little that like I was only like 3 or 4, and the kid was maybe 6 or 7, and the kid like beat me up all the time. It was pretty bad. But my parents didn't put me into martial arts until later when I moved to Chicago, and I've told this story before, but what happened was I was running in the hallways in Chinese school because most immigrant families are overachieving, right? So they put their kids in additional school on the weekends. But I think I was 5. I was running in the hallways and my head collided with another kid and I had a standing concussion. I was standing there crying with the standing concussion, and that's when my dad put me in Kung Fu. So after that, he's like, "Oh, it was more like." The kid cried instead of fought the kid. It wasn't even like he was bullying me. We just collided. And it's funny because like you punched your bully in the face after doing, karate. For me, I did kung fu for like a year, and then I saw this kid again, and I was like ready to challenge him. But this kid just had good fight IQ. He came up to me and leg kicked me. I was like, "Whoa, this kid kicks me? What the?" You don't expect people to be kicking in the '90s, right? Especially
Sure.
kids who never did martial arts. But this kid must have either trained a martial art or he had good fight IQ. He came and he didn't kick. At normal spot, he kicked my thigh. I was like, okay, I'm still gonna fight you. And a teacher stopped it, so I never got to follow up the fight with the kid I like bumped heads with.
Wow, that's funny. That's crazy.
Yeah, and when I went back to China a few years after that, I wanted to see if that neighbor who used to hit me when I was a little kid, I want to see if he was there, but he went to America. It's pretty funny. So like everyone goes to America, and then his name was Meng Fanshen. I still wish one day I could see him. So I'd be like, hey, okay, now we're adults. Let's see if you're gonna hit me again. Like I guess I didn't even realize it until hearing your story. I guess I still want to fight that guy. I didn't realize that, because it was so young in my life that I forgot about it. But now it's like hearing your story. It's like maybe I should hit him once. Maybe just in sparring, just to.
Your movie is not finished. You have not settled the score yet. You will
not
do it
settled the
eventually.
score with this guy, and I didn't even realize. It's crazy.
Absolutely, that's funny.
Wow. So yeah, let's keep going with Wing Chun. So when you started doing Wing Chun, was it kind of mostly training kind of forms and stuff, or did you guys get into sparring pretty quickly?
So I actually have a very different Wing Chun background than I think a lot of people who do Wing Chun at whatever high level. When I moved to Seattle, I got my black belt in Taekwondo at age 15, but I wanted to do Bruce Lee's martial art, whether that was Jeet Kune Do or it was Wing Chun. Mm-hmm. And oddly enough, one day I'm walking in we lived in a suburb of Seattle. I'm walking and I see this school called the Kung Fu Club of Issaquah. And I look at that and I go, Kung Fu? Kind of like a brick and mortar school. It's like that moment in Way of the Dragon where John Ben goes, Kung Fu. And I walk in there and the instructor, he tells me, I teach Wing Chun. And I'm like, oh, Wing Chun? Oh my God. This is the thing I've been reading about for years in magazines. I knew that Bruce Lee had done it. And oddly enough, that Wing Chun school was a descendant, not of a traditional variant of Wing Chun, but they were descendants of Bruce Lee's original students in Seattle.
Wow.
So the Wing Chun that they taught is not the classical Wing Chun. It's been called non-classical Kung Fu, or sometimes they call it the Wing Chun between Wing Chun and Jeet Kune Do. It's his pre-Jeet Kune Do era. Wow. So it was already a pretty modified Wing Chun style, focused a lot more on kind of going forward, modified stance for Chi Sao, and it was in my opinion, a very practical style. Unlike my Taekwondo training, it was the first time I went to a martial arts school where they were addressing the type of fighting that happens outside of your style. Because in Taekwondo, all the sparring is always Taekwondo versus Taekwondo, right? And here it was like, okay, well, if a boxer's coming at you like this, I'm like, a boxer? Because, for me, that was a novel idea to, okay, if someone gives you a low kick, like a Muay Thai style, or if someone tries to do a takedown, because our instructor was also doing some grappling at that time. So for me, it was like both learning this art that I wanted to learn, but it was kind of a very modernized way of doing it. And this was in the early days of UFC. So as a teenager, this was like kind of the perfect thing for me. And I did that for about 3 years. And towards the tail end of that training, I actually competed in a sport jiu-jitsu tournament. It was 1997. I actually just found the rule sheet from that thing. It was like in a stack of papers back in my house. and it was not a grappling tournament. It was called Sport Jiu-Jitsu, and it mixed striking and basic grappling, but I had a lot of rules as far as the grappling goes. When you went to the ground, I think you could only grapple for 20 or 30 seconds before they stood you up. But I had done some grappling with my first Sifu, and obviously I did the stand-up with Wing Chun, and he asked me on a few days' notice if I wanted to do it. And I was like, sure. I was like 18 or 19 or something like that. And I was like, whatever, fine. I haven't trained specially for this. Let me go and fight some jujitsu or, do this tournament of which I don't know the rules. And I went there, and it was at James DeMile's school. James DeMile was Bruce Lee's third student. Wow. So I got to meet James DeMile, and he sat and talked to me about Bruce Lee. And for me, the coolest thing was they didn't have enough people for the different weight classes. So I had to actually fight someone who was a heavier weight class than me, and he was a jiu-jitsu guy, not a Brazilian jiu-jitsu guy, more like a traditional jiu-jitsu guy. But everyone at that time was, because of UFC, was starting to grapple. That was like at the beginning of all of that. So I had to fight this much bigger brown belt in jiu-jitsu, and I beat him. And I beat him in front of James DeMile, which is like one of the great, like, how cool is it to use Wing Chun to beat even a traditional jiu-jitsu guy in front of one of Bruce Lee's students? Was probably one of the greatest days of my life. Wow. And then my second fight, I had to fight one of James DeMile's students. But I was so gassed out from the first fight. He just took me down and choked me in 30 seconds. But I was like, I can lose to a Wing Chun guy. I'm cool with that. At least I beat a jiu-jitsu guy, right? So I was happy about that. And that was kind of the tail end of that. And then after that, I started training in the Leung Tang system of Wing Chun, and I went to Europe to do it full time. So I actually went from a more modern variant to a more traditional or classical one, although the Leung Tang system is a little bit more forward thinking than some of the other ones. Of course, Sifu Leung Tang also has his own personal issues and stuff like that. But his Wing Chun style is, in my opinion, quite progressive. And so it also fit the bill for me. And I've been doing that now for 22, 23 years. And actually even longer than that now, almost 25 years. And I've been teaching here in New York. Next year will be my 20th year teaching.
Wow. And I think that's a nice question too to follow up on, which is, who are the students that come into your studio now, your gym now? What are they? Because you're kind of very close to Times Square, which, by the way, people, one day I will go visit Alex, and we're all gonna do a meetup or something. All my viewers gotta come. We gotta all sign up for classes. But you're right next to Times Square. Do you get tourists? Do you get New Yorkers? What type of people come to learn from you right now?
So for my entire teaching career here in New York, we get local New Yorkers, and we also get people who work in this area, because the area that I'm in, with this area, Midtown, is not a very residential area. So most of my students who train with me, they work here, but they maybe don't live in this area. They might live in another part of New York, or maybe they commute from New Jersey. So most of my students tend to be professionals. I don't even have a kids class, which is something that kind of blows people away when I tell them that I have a professional martial arts school with, my school is 2 floors. We have the 4th and 5th floor here in Midtown. And when I tell people that I do all this without a kids program, some of them think that I'm crazy. But I teach, enough professional adults where I've never actually needed to have a kids program. And so that means that I can pretty much do it the way I want to do it. And that's made it a lot more rewarding.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. And you're the 3rd, 4th floor. Is your building like a really tall building, or is it just like you're on the top floors?
No, I have the 2 top floors. This is an older building. This building is almost 100 years old, built in 1922. And I have the 4th and 5th floor, which are the 2 top floors of the building. So it's a walk up. The joke was always people asked me, did people come to challenge me in the early days? And I said, well, I don't know, because by the time they got up here, they were probably tired already because they have to walk up the stairs.
Yeah. It's kind of funny because the first match that Shushadong had with Lele, the first MMA with Tai Chi match that set off this entire kind of debate, it was up in the sky too. I don't remember which floor it was, but lots of high rises in Chengdu, China. So it was like a gym very high up in the sky. So
wow.
I'm surprised Lele made it all the way up there. I guess he used the elevator.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, maybe that's the trick. If there's no elevator, then you're just wearing out your opponent by the time they get up there.
Yeah, yeah. One time I had a kung fu person. Yeah, she's a very good girl. Props to her. She's like, yeah, I want to spar you. I want to see how my kung fu is. I'm like, sure. And then I walked her to the beach, which isn't a long walk. It's like a 5-minute walk since I live right there. The beach is right there. By the time we got to the beach, she's like, oh, I'm tired. So, yeah, I think that's the secret. You wear out people who
Sure.
want to challenge you.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
and meanwhile, it's not planned. The only reason I'm here is because this is about the only space you can afford teaching martial arts in New York. If you're on the ground floor or your building has an elevator, I mean, the rent would be 3-4 times what I pay.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so that's the reason why it's affordable, because I live in, in an old pre-war walk-up. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Wow. Wow. So, for viewers who are watching this, Alex made this amazing, amazing reflection on the whole craziness behind that Fight Quest episode. So after you made that video, got some views, did anyone from whether the original Fight Quest episode or any of the producers, did anyone see it and contact you? Tell me more about kind of like what happened afterwards, because I'm sure it ruffled some feathers and stuff. I mean, I was like really mad hearing they didn't want the white guy in it. Like that just pissed me off. So tell me, did anyone contact you? Any kind of follow-ups?
No, but like literally every other comment on that video is, did you see what Jimmy said about that episode of Fight Quest? Because Jimmy did his own take on it, which came out before my episode. And it's just funny because, I mean, you have a big YouTube channel, so you know the whole thing about repeat comments. And it's like, yeah, you're like the 900th person to ask if I watched this before. The funny thing is that Jimmy didn't have a very favorable opinion of Sifu Leung. But the thing is, people will assume that me being a former student of Sifu Leung, I would take issue with that. But from Jimmy's perspective, the way, he was brought in by the producers and he basically shows up, films it, and then leaves. I 100% understand why his viewpoint is the way it is, because he basically shows up and he shoots his scenes and then he goes, and then so he sees what is kind of being presented to him. And so like I actually don't disagree with most of what Jimmy Smith said about that episode, even though it sounds like it's at odds with some of the things I said. I was so excited about this episode because, I mean, the producer came here, like I talked about, and said, it's the final of the second season or whatever, and they wanted to do something a little bit different because it's always like, they train for 3 days and then they have to fight people from that school, which I think is kind of an odd format. I mean, at the very least, you should train this person for 3 days, and at the end, then they have to fight your guys. It seems kind of weird because you're bringing them up. Why wouldn't you then maybe train in this school for 3 days, he trains in this school for 3 days, and then have them fight the guys from the other school? At least that would like make more sense, right? But there was a lot of ignorance from this guy, Charles or whatever. And, and I get full disclosure, when I did that video and I kind of did the voice and everyone loved the voice, like Charles, with the chin out and stuff like this, I didn't remember his name. I just made up Charles because he acted like a Charles. Turns out the producer's name actually was Charles.
Oh,
So because I later Googled it and I was like, I wonder what that guy's name is. Oh crap. so I can imagine people thought that maybe I did that on purpose, but I don't know. Maybe I did somehow remember his name. I'm not really great with names, so I tend to not think that, but like I just picked that random name. So when he talked, he said they want to do something different. I said, hey, look, Wing Chun, according to lore, according to legend, whether you want to believe it or not, was designed to fight against other martial arts styles, right? And this has kind of always been the lore about Kung Fu stuff. Look at old Kung Fu movies. It's this style versus this style. And, the guy has to learn this style to be able to overcome the other style or whatever. So instead of having Wing Chun fight Wing Chun at the end, which is always messy, you have two people trying to chain punch. It's just an orgy of hand chasing, slappy nonsense. This is like, literally the worst thing in the world. Why don't we have them fight against other Kung Fu styles? I mean, imagine if you had Doug learn Wing Chun, from Kong Chi Kong, and Jimmy learns Wing Chun from Leung Tang. They learn for 3 days, and at the end, they have to fight one Hong Kun guy, one Choi Lei Fat guy, and then one, some maybe Southern Mantis guy or something like that, right? I mean, how much cooler would that have been? And that producer, he was like, that's a great idea. And we were even emailing back and forth with Sifu Leung. I have the emails where he's saying like, yeah, and then what guy are we going to get to? What styles can you get and all this kind of stuff? Only to show up in Hong Kong, he's like, no, we're not going to do that. They're just going to fight your guys. And then, of course, the big problem for my former teacher at that time is that, in Hong Kong, most people are really busy. They just do martial arts kind of for fun. And so it wasn't the 70s anymore. He used to have a bunch of fighters in the 70s. Now, most of the guys who train with him are hobbyists, and they didn't really have anyone ready to go. And, it doesn't matter how good your Wing Chun is, or it doesn't matter how good you are at T-Sao or fighting. If you want to put a helmet on and put gloves on and you want to fight someone like Jimmy, who is actually a professional MMA fighter, yet you're not going to put the accountant who shows up twice a week and go, go in there and chain punch and good luck, And so Leung Ting was wise enough to know that that would be an issue. But the producer didn't want to let any of the non-Chinese people fight, including me, including one of my students. And so that left them only with the Chinese students they had in Hong Kong, who at that time, they just had a bunch of hobbyists there. And I was scrambling in the middle of the night because I had a Korean student. This just shows you how ridiculous that producer was. Because one of the Wing Chun, one of my sihengs in that episode, he's Korean. And when Charles was going like, no, we can't have anybody who's, not Chinese in the episode, Sifu Richter said, well, just so you know that guy over there is Korean. He literally said, well, the audience isn't going to be able to tell. And so, and so you just get kind of an idea of just like, the guy's Asian enough, right? And I always thought, hey, I'm 5'7". I'm not like a big, tall guaylo, I'm like, you put a helmet on me, I have dark hair. No one's going to not know that you don't even see the face of the people anyway, right?
Yeah.
But they were like, no. And so literally at the 11th hour, I had a student here in New York. This is back in 2008, 2009. He's a police officer, Korean, and, also had boxing experience and a really good fighter, and one of my senior students at that time. And we were trying to fly him over just so we had an Asian guy to fight Jimmy, because they were not letting any of the Western guys fight. And then finally, Sifu Richter flew over this big Italian guy, Paul Cordy. And then the story was, at the last minute, of course, they're not going to let him fight because he's not a Chinese guy. And Jimmy got something wrong in his video, because he basically thought that Paul, the guy that Leung Ting brought, was just some like tough guy that Leung Ting hired because he had no students to fight against Jimmy. But that guy was actually from our school, from our lineage. It's just that he happened to not be Chinese. So Jimmy was actually wrong on that point. He wasn't like some random hired gun. He's literally a Wing Chun instructor. And so, it ended up being really disappointing. I mentioned, I believe on that episode, I shot the entire fight on I had like a high 8 camera at that time. And I have the tapes back somewhere. I need to look it up. I shot it from the rooftop, and you could see the fights were all rigged. Like the way they edited it, it was like they knew how many fights Doug would win, and they wanted to make Jimmy lose one of his fights because the producer clearly didn't like Leung Ting after they were kind of butting heads. And when you see the whole fight, you go like, Doug and Jimmy, I think Doug maybe legit actually lost one of his fights, but Jimmy didn't lose any of his fights, and they made him lose one. And so, all the lines that they were saying were pre-written. You think it's a reality show, and while they're watching the demonstration, they're like, all right, Jimmy, we want you to say like, whoa, that's a crazy kick, or what? Like, they're literally feeding him the lines. I mean, the whole thing, it's about as real as a TVB soap opera. It's like, it's not what people think. Yeah.
It's funny because one of my friends right now is doing camera on a dating show. And I say which dating show. I'm not going to say what kind of camera, but he's doing camera on a dating show. And he's telling me, he comes back. I'm like, dude, is anything of it legit? He's like, no. They're doing takes and retakes of like their dates and stuff. I'm like, okay, all right. So now I know even these dating shows are completely scripted, completely just full of BS.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, you would think a show like Fight Quest, you don't really need to script that. Yeah, maybe you tell the guys to say a couple things, but that's actually a show that you want to see that show done for real.
Yeah.
And the entire thing was scripted. There's a sequence where they're on a boat, and like my Siheng, the Korean one, he does a roundhouse kick to Jimmy, and Jimmy goes into the water. I mean, that was all scripted. They literally discussed that beforehand, that they were going to do that. None of that was like even real. So it's just like, all right, well, it is what it is. The consolation prize of that episode is, although they only put one bit where I was in the demonstration at the beginning, and they cut out all the other bits that I was in, I did meet my current wife on that trip, so it ended up being a success anyway. So I can't complain too much about Fight Quest, because I got my wife, I have 2 beautiful kids now, so everything worked out fine. Yeah.
Well, man, I'm really happy that happened. Is your wife a martial artist too?
No, so the furthest thing from it, she's a lawyer from Hong Kong.
Okay.
And she knows nothing about martial arts, and which is fine because every day all I do is talk martial arts, do martial arts, and it's kind of nice to come home and have a break from that. But she's into all the martial arts gossip. Well, this Sifu doesn't like this Sifu, and she helps me do a lot of translation stuff for different projects that I do, and yeah, and it's just funny when I introduce. Sometimes I hang out with maybe like Law Mong, who's like a famous Shaw Brothers, veteran. He was the Toad from Five Deadly Venoms, and like for her, she didn't realize he had a kung fu movie career in the 70s. For her, she was like, "Oh, isn't he just some guy from TVB?" And I'm like, "How dare you?" And then we're like hanging out with him, and like in her mind, he's just some guy who did some TVB. And I'm like, "No, you don't understand."
Yeah.
So we have a funny dynamic.
Exactly like you said, a lot of these famous Hong Kong actors and stuff, you really go far back into their career. You're like, oh, I remember when he was an extra. Even Tony Liang, Liang Chaowei, and Stephen Chow, Zhou Xinci, they both like were in like these really old shows as extras before they made it onto the big screen. It's so funny really going back and looking.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Man. Yeah, so I mean, being in New York now, there's probably some opportunity also to still do kind of this type of show, right? This type of filmmaking stuff, or have you kind of your experience with Fight Quest made you kind of like, okay, no more dealing with producers and stuff like that?
Yeah, it is difficult because sometimes people ask me, other Kung Fu Sifus here in New York, sometimes they'll go, like, how are you able to run a school? How are you able to get students? And like, I almost say it with a little bit of sarcasm, but it's kind of true. I'm one of the few Sifus in New York who's not trying to be a movie star. There are a lot of, Chinese martial arts teachers here that they're always trying to get into movies and they're trying to do all this stuff. And as a result, they never really focus on building a school or doing any of that. For me, I have absolutely zero interest in becoming a movie star or doing any of that kind of stuff because no one is going to be rushing to buy tickets to see this guy on the big screen, right? So for me, I can focus on teaching and improving my martial arts and improving what I do. Having said that, I am and have been working on for a few years a documentary on Yip Man. And this is something that I talked about for a while on the podcast. And there are a few of Yip Man students left that are alive. And they're, of course, obviously very old right now. And there's just a select handful of them that can still tell stories and things. And before they're gone, I want to get all of this stuff on camera, especially now that Yip Man is so kind of hyper popularized by the Yip Man movies. I don't want the same thing to happen to Yip Man that happened to Wong Fei Hong, where when you talk about Wong Fei Hong, most people cannot discern between, is this story of Wong Fei Hong something from one of the films, or is this something actually like from his history? And I want to make sure that these legitimate stories get preserved before, 50 years from now, everyone's going to think that, Yip Man beat up 10 black belts while the Japanese were occupying China, right? Because his real story, while not as fantastical as the movie stuff, his real story is very compelling. He's a man who overcame great hardships to become one of the most iconic martial arts teachers. I mean, think about it. He was born in the Qing dynasty. When he was a child, he had the queue with the shaved head in the front. That was the period he was born in. And when he dies in 72, he dies in a modern Hong Kong where some of his students are even movie stars. So to look at the time span and change within China and Hong Kong, just within the lifespan of Yip Man, I mean, this is someone who lived through an incredibly rich time period in China. And turning him into a mindless Superman, like what's been done in some of the movies, I think is taking away from what's a real, genuine story about him. So I want to, hopefully when COVID passes and I can finally go back to Hong Kong, I'll be able to restart the project. So very excited about that.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing project you're doing, and I totally agree with you about sort of the mission because, like you said about Wang Fei Hong. The thing about it is that we don't even have a picture of him. I learned recently that picture that most people associate with him, that's actually his son.
Yes.
So we don't even have documentation of what he looked like, right? And then, like you said, all these movies mystifying him, so nobody knows what he's really done. So yeah, the fear is because too many people believe movies to be way more biographical than they actually are. In 100 years, 50 years, people will be like, oh, there'll actually be like essays and videos made. Yes, he actually beat up 10 black belts. We know it's going to happen. So it has to be stopped now.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because Yip Man is one of the first of those masters that we have some contemporary record of, right?
Yeah.
Even with Wong Fei Hong, I mean, really, we only know about Lam Sai Wing, his student Lam Sai Wing. We have a few photos of him, and then some of his students, have continued to teach on. But like, yeah, Wong Fei Hong, like, most of what we know about him personally was from his last wife, Miss Mok, and she didn't really have that much interesting to say. So I mean, the problem is like, it now gets mystified, and it's understandable with the older generation because we really don't know. I mean, same with Fo Yun Gap, Huo Yuan Jia, and those, like, there's really not a lot that we know. But I think with Yip Man, we can stop the bleeding on this problem because he's still contemporary enough, and there's still some people around who knew him that I think we can fix that before it becomes a problem.
Yeah, and the one I will add to the list is Yang Luchan, the founder of Yang style Tai Chi. So many stories about him, but like, there's no documentation. So again, he's been mysticized too. Whenever people are like, "Oh yeah, could Tai Chi actually fight?" They always say, "Oh, look at Yang Luchan, the founder of Yang Tai Chi. He beat up a gorilla back in the day. Yeah, he would like 10-second beat up any challenger." It's like, okay, how much of that is myth, like with Wang Fei Hong, or like you said with Huo Yuanjia or anyone? So yeah, and Itman's the perfect person because there's so much attention, but there's also a lot of documentation. Let's get the mysticism out of the way. Yeah, dude, I love this project.
Yeah, I'm excited about it, and I've been working on it for a number of years. I have a timeline of everything I've collected about Yip Man's life, and it's 40 pages long. And I have like every date, every new. I go on a Hong Kong online archives for Hong Kong newspapers, and I've collected all the newspaper articles that were written about him while he was alive. And then I put everything in a timeline, and like I have this exhaustive record right now. And we have a really compelling story. There's a big reveal about Yip Man that people don't know about, that we want to reveal in the documentary. So yeah, I just can't wait as soon as Hong Kong lets me back in, because right now with the COVID restrictions, I really cannot go back. And this is the longest time I have not been to Hong Kong since the 2000s. Last time I was there was 2019. I usually go every year, 1 to 2 times a year. So I just feel like, oh, I need to go back. I need to do more, and I just waiting and waiting and waiting. So
Yeah. Wow. Do you ever interact with some of the other branches of Wing Chun?
So I do. I mean, what's funny is in the 80s, there were so many Wing Chun schools in New York. You had the Moyet and Jason Lau and all the different lineages. Nowadays is a little bit less. Some of those guys have moved out, and there's some Wing Chun in New York taught in like different places. But in terms of like the real brick and mortar schools, like real professional school where you can come in, it's really me and Sifu William Kwok from Practical Wing Chun. He's a Wang Kam Leung student.
Mhm.
And whereas in the 80s, a lot of the Wing Chun Sifus tended to not really get along too well. Sifu Kwok and I, like, I consider him one of my great friends, and we meet, and we have a very, very amicable and very good relationship. So we don't have like any of that old weird stuff from the old days. As far as training, I actually find the problem with Wing Chun sometimes is like understanding, okay, so if we're going to train, we're either just going to spar, like we'll put the gloves on and we go back and forth, or if we're going to do chi sao, we have to understand like there has to be some kind of rules, because it's like if one person uses controlled force and just kind of launches the other guy or whatever, and then the other guy comes back and hits the other one full power, then at that point I go, all right, well, how about we just put gloves on and fight? Because then when the problem is, unlike where jujitsu and grappling has a tremendous advantage, because we could say, all right, we can just roll. And then, if I catch you in something, you tap out, we can start over. The problem with chi sao is like what's considered acceptable for power and control in one school is unacceptable in the other. And you basically have very different languages when between the different styles of chi sao, that they're not always compatible. And chi sao almost always starts as this friendly thing and then ends up in a weird brawl. And then for me, I go, well, then why didn't you just spar instead of pretending you're going to train something back and forth, which both parties clearly don't want to concede anything to the other one. So basically, it's just a passive aggressive exchange veiled as chi sao. And I go, just put gloves on, and if you want to have a comparison, then say, okay, you give me 5 attacks, I give you 5 attacks, and if we're still not convinced, then we'll just all out spar. but let's not do chi sao and pretend that it's something that it's not. If we're going to fight, might as well just fight, right?
Yeah. 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 And I love what you said. So I'll tell a story. I'll only name one name. One of my buddies here in LA, Jin Young, he's a Wing Chun guy, but he's also a brown
Yes.
belt in Jiu-Jitsu. So back in the day, there was a guy who wanted to do Chi Sao with him. Not going to name names. They're doing Chi Sao. The guy approached it exactly like a passive aggressive thing to start escalating force. Jin's like, dude, that's not what Chi Sao is for. And after the third time, Jin just took his back and choked him out. He's like, you want to fight? Okay, I'm going to choke you out. And the guy's like, what? That's not what Chi Sao is. And Jin's like, well, you're not doing Chi Sao by trying to like hit me in the face and stuff like that. So yeah, my story that Jin told me is exactly illustrative of your, very few people can let their egos go and be like, oh, it's a sensitivity / connection thing. Oh, okay, that's what I'm trying to feel. I'm trying to feel this connection, It's like, I practice a little bit of Aikido with some friends, and some of these Aikido exercises are kind of similar to Chi Sao in a very weird way. Like, a lot of Aikido, you're not supposed to use it on the street. It's not even supposed to be self-defense. It's just connection, right? But like, people misunderstand. It's like, oh yeah, I do the Steven Seagal Aikido. I could throw 6 people in the street. It's like, no, that's not what Aikido is. Aikido literally, like the words mean like peace. It's like, what are you doing,
Right,
So,
right.
But yeah,
absolutely.
Funny segue, and yes, a lot of people misunderstanding, and then it makes Chi Sao look bad because then it just looks like people just doing like weird kind of half sparring, half ego thing.
Yeah, absolutely, 100% agree. Yeah, it's the problem. It's incompatible languages, and it's ego, and you don't have this problem for example, in jiu-jitsu, right? And because it's very clear what you're practicing.
Yeah.
And that's the problem, is that it's not clear when 2 schools do Chi Sao, what are we actually doing here, right? So I find that actually I don't really interact too much with the other Wing Chun schools. What I do is I'll bring in people from totally different styles here. So I brought one of my good friends, Maxivu. He's a Hong Kong master. I brought him a couple of years ago for one of my seminars, and I said, I want you to show my students how Hong Kong people fight and what their ideas are, so that they know about it and they understand it more. Because if that's the real bridge, is to have understanding between the different martial arts. I also brought my friend Magno Gama. He's one of Renzo Gracie's top guys from here in New York. Magno's a good friend of mine, and I train with Magno, and I wanted my guys to know something about jiu-jitsu. So I brought Magno Gama in, and this was last year during COVID, and he demonstrated all this stuff and showed how all these things worked. And my students asked, okay, if someone does this, what would you do? And so I find that they get a little bit richer from those experiences, as opposed to going, well, our Tan Sao is this way, their Tan Sao is this way, and let's discuss this for an hour. I'd rather say, hey, look, this is a top of the food chain jiu-jitsu guy. Let's have him show you how he would take you down to the ground, so we can maybe improve the way we do our takedown defense, rather than worry about how another style does Bong Sao, So that's kind of more the way I tend to look at it.
Yeah. And the one final thing I'll add to this is I rarely use Facebook, but my deal with myself is that I only use Facebook to promote fight commentary breakdowns now. So I'm in a lot of martial arts groups on Facebook, and the craziest, most angry ones are the Wing Chun Kung Fu groups. They're always arguing among themselves. Oh my goodness, dude.
Yeah, I people are always a little bit shocked. I've said it on the podcast a bunch of times. I go like, I don't actually like most Wing Chun people. And when I say that, people always feel like, like, how can you say that? Because most people, whatever style they do, their style is the best, and they're always going to be an apologist for their style. But I find that a lot of the problems that Wing Chun has, both image-wise and also within Wing Chun itself, it's the fault of the Wing Chun people and the way that they think, and that they're just so siloed in their own way of looking at stuff. And it's like, I would much rather have a conversation with a boxing trainer, with a jiu-jitsu guy, with a traditional karate guy, more than I would prefer to have a conversation with another Wing Chun guy, because it just, the conversations are very circular within the Wing Chun world, and they're relitigating stuff that happened in the 1950s. And they're to a certain degree living off of a reputation that is out of date. Okay. And Wing Chun had a tremendous reputation in Hong Kong when, one, no one knew what Wing Chun was about, and two, they were mostly fighting other traditional martial arts. And they were not fighting boxers and MMA. And I know Bruce Lee had his fight against a boxer, but yeah, that was boxing in a boxing ring. And so to kind of say that because, the early students of Yip Man went out there and made a name for Wing Chun by beating the other styles, that's 100% true. But they were not fighting someone who had a wrestling background. They were not fighting someone who had the footwork of a boxer. And nowadays, what you have is you have people who can punch and kick and wrestle and grapple. And this is a different thing. Now, Wing Chun is an intelligent style when it's done correctly. So how do we improve Wing Chun? Well, we don't improve it by going, well, no one can take me to the ground because I'll just chain punch them. Well, if you believe that, let someone try to take you down and try that. And if it doesn't work, figure out how to make it work rather than just, staying in this kind of self-serving bias of staying within your own, like your own blogosphere and only talking to the same people and propping up, your own ideas. It's very incestuous. And so I find conversations with most Wing Chun Sifus to be quite mind-numbing and useless.
Yeah. Like you said, it's really, really easy to get stuck in your own bubble, especially nowadays with social media. Social media was supposed to open up the world, but instead it just made people more stuck in their bubbles. And then these platforms to cater towards them get them even more stuck in their bubble. So even if they wanted to, they're recommending new stuff that still fits their bias. So they think, oh, whoa, yeah, everything agrees with me. Oh my God.
Yeah, absolutely. You can do the experiment. You can, if you have 2 Gmail accounts, you can log into them separately on YouTube and look up, why Wing Chun sucks on one YouTube account, on the other one, like Wing Chun best fight style, and just watch what YouTube will recommend the 2 different accounts. And then people wonder why people don't see the way they look at it. It's like, you look at a couple things, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, whatever, they're going to start catering to what they think, what they think you want to see. I can't tell you how many times I've had a conversation with my wife about something that we want to get for the house. And next time I'm on Instagram, boom, that thing is right there. And you're like, oh. So if it's happening in those things, it's certainly happening with the bigger conversations we're having about martial arts.
Yeah. And I'm sure you can do that experiment with my channel or with Alex's channel. If you start watching a specific themed video, it'll only start showing you that type of video, because from the very beginning, I've looked at Kung Fu positively and negatively, right? But then I kept getting accused on both sides. Some people would say, you're an apologist. Some people are like, oh, you hate Chinese culture, you hate Kung Fu, you hate everything Asian. I was like, what are these people looking at? And then I realized, oh, the platform's literally only serving them a specific type of video, so they don't see all my videos, so they get a view even of this one channel. That's so crazy. And I was like, wow. So the one thing I will give the Wing Chun community credit is whenever I make a video that's looking positively on Kung Fu, I tell the Wing Chun community, dude, give it some likes, go spread it. They usually do it. So I give them credit for that. As much as the infighting annoys me, but they are really supportive when I create a positive video on martial arts, on Kung Fu.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. And it's also funny too, like when I recently I did a somewhat controversial video, which about these revelations that came out about Bruce Lee recently. And that was like my, I'm sure your channel is very big. I'm sure you had one video that kind of changed the way your channel was, like maybe it was small and then you did one video and it changed it. So for me, unfortunately, it was a video that was about cocaine and not Kung Fu, right? So everyone came to me for that. And the number of people who were like accusing me of being a Bruce Lee hater. And I'm like, have you even seen any of my other videos? Like I did a 4-part series on a 20-minute conversation Bruce Lee had, and like went in detail. And like the man, I am not like a delusional fanboy that thinks like, yo, you put Bruce Lee in there with Francis Ngannou, and somebody commented today, Bruce Lee would kill Francis Ngannou in less than 5 seconds. And I go, are you insane? And you know what the unfortunate thing is who never would have believed that would have been Bruce Lee.
Exactly.
Bruce Lee was well aware of it. And the problem is you have these delusional fanboys who are putting him on a pedestal that he himself never put himself on. In some of his conversations and notes, he had a really good eye for boxing and footwork, and he understood why there were weight classes, and he understood like how these things, he was a realist and he really understood it. The problem is like, it's the weird delusional people that are saying that he could go in and beat up everyone in UFC or whatever. And he's not the one who ever said that. So I feel he's like unfairly criticized on a pedestal that he never put himself on to begin with. And so, yeah, people come to me because they see this Bruce Lee drug letters video and they think it's a hit piece, even though I believe it's a very fair take. If you watch it, I'm literally just reading letters out loud. And at the end of the video, I'm like, I'm not going to tell you what to think about it. You're an adult. You can decide for yourself. And people are like, why do you hate Bruce Lee? And like, what would you like it if, your personal life came out like this or whatever? And, I start trolling some of the people in the comments. I go, well, hey, I have the good sense to, when I ask for cocaine, to text for it and not to write it in letters. Okay. And then delete the text afterwards. Okay. It's like, it's kind of funny because like you said, people are kind of, they're tunneled to your channel and they see it through one lens and they don't realize, like, I have 2 interviews with John Little where we talk about Bruce Lee's training methods and about the fights that he had and things like that. And I have nothing but love for Bruce Lee, but Bruce Lee told us we have to look at the truth as it is. And if these things came out, we have to talk about it. We can't bury our head in the sand and pretend they don't exist. And I mean, they let the man rest in peace, but this came out and I think it needs to be addressed. It explains a lot about the last few years of his life and it helps us understand more what was going on. So I don't think it's that negative of a thing.
Yeah, exactly. And another interesting topic that maybe we'll have to explore another time, and maybe you've actually explored this on your channel too. The Wong Jack Man fight with Bruce Lee, there's a lot of controversy that a lot of, I think, Bruce Lee people who pedestalize him aren't examining completely, because I've heard quite a few people say he actually lost that fight. Again, that's controversial. So, like,
Right.
There's some people who were there at the fight who claimed, either it was a draw or Wong Jack Man slipped, so Bruce Lee won, etc. But there are some other people say, no, actually, Wong Jack Man won the fight. So, that's another rabbit hole to go down. But yeah, there's a lot of things, if you don't accept that we have to look at the truth and not just look at myths, there's a lot of things that can't even be touched if you really just go down that path. And,
Sure.
that's both our channels are not about that.
Right. Absolutely. You can look at things the way they are. And, I mean, look, we all know when you train martial arts for many years, I've been doing martial arts since I was 8. I'm now 43. So you can do the math on that. And I'm not saying that this was the case between Bruce Lee and Wong Jack Man, but you learn the most from your defeats. You learn the most from your losses. You learn the most from when you slip and fall on your face.
Yeah.
And we also know this with professional fighters. Sometimes they have a very poor performance and then they come back to go on a win streak because they make those adjustments. And so, and the problem is that I think it's because so many people have never really trained martial arts in a way where they put themselves out there and allowed themselves to be vulnerable. And that means that there's a chance that you can lose. And if you lose, you frame it differently because you have to keep going. And I think only people who've never actually been in a fight and never got their ass kicked and never got punched in the face can look at someone losing a fight and go, oh man, what a loser. And it's like, Muhammad Ali lost fights and GSP lost fights. And I mean, tell me what, and even if someone had an undefeated record, for sure that person got his ass kicked while he was coming up. For sure he got his ass kicked in the gym. And that's what you learn from. And if someone doesn't need to be undefeated to be someone who is great and has something of value to teach and someone who has a legacy worth remembering. Because if it was solely, I mean, think about it. Who is the people's champ in boxing? Everyone loves Muhammad Ali because of his character. He lost fights and he fought way too long. Floyd Mayweather's undefeated, but he will never be viewed the same way as Muhammad Ali ever. So the problem is, so like, even when you have the example of the undefeated fighter, then you go, okay, so is he really the greatest because he was undefeated? Or maybe the guy who actually lost and came back and did something and was a symbol for the people, maybe that guy was a little bit greater. So I think that, yeah, there's just a lot of like, kind of weird posturing when it comes to if someone loses and, what that means for them. And I don't think it's that big of a deal.
Yeah. I think that was one of the greatest things that we just talked about. It's so true. And it's a good reminder for me too, because, sometimes I'll look at fighters, I'm like, oh, you lost. I'm guilty of that. I think a lot of us are guilty of that. So, but it's so true. You can't, just because someone's lost a little bit or something, that doesn't mean they don't have something good to teach. That's such a great point you made.
Yeah. I mean, I always think about like a GSP when he lost to Matt Serra, he lost the belt. No one thought that GSP would ever lose to Matt Serra. And he gets caught and he gets TKO'd, I think, right? He later comes back and, goes on this amazing undefeated streak since that fight and goes on to be one of the most legendary welterweight champions ever in UFC. But I remember one time he talked about it, like, what did he learn from that? When he had his fight with Carlos Condit, in that fight, he got kicked in the head and he got rocked. And there was a moment when he was kind of on wobbly legs. And he said, had it not been for the loss that he had to Matt Serra, he would have rushed in at that moment when he got clipped. And that's what he did with Matt Serra. When he got clipped, he just kept going. And then that's when he finally lost. But because when he got clipped, he had to give himself a moment to kind of, get his clear head and reestablish kind of, what he's doing. And then he ends up winning that fight. So he ends up winning this fight, which sustained this amazing record he had because of one of his most embarrassing losses, right? And so I think that is a much better frame. Let's pretend that Wong Jack Man, someone who came from a forms-based martial art and didn't really have any street fighting experience, that he beat Bruce Lee. Okay, let's just pretend. Well, then what did Bruce Lee go and end up doing after that fight? All right, he ends up totally remodeling the way that he trained. He ends up, getting really fanatic about heavy bag training and cardio and doing this and doing that. And then ends up becoming one of the most iconic movie stars after that. So you could also frame it that way. And meanwhile, Wong Jack Man, all right, what happened to him? All right. And so, and I was always of the opinion, if you didn't like Wong Jack Man's story about the Bruce Lee fight, just wait, it'll change, because he changed his story so many times. And for me, in his posse, he had David Chin, who was basically the instigator for that whole fight. And David Chin was on Wong Jack Man's side, and David Chin said Wong Jack Man lost the fight. So people in the Wong Jack Man camp said that he lost. And for me, that's good enough. I guarantee you, if we could watch a video of the fight, it would have been hysterical, because by all accounts, Bruce is chasing this guy who doesn't really want to engage with him. And this is one of the problems with Wing Chun. When you're going forward and you want to put the heat on someone and someone just backs away, where you're going to keep chasing that dude for the next 10 city blocks to chain punch the guy, right? You need to stop and go, well, hey, if you don't want to fight, we don't fight, or you come back in and we do it. But what do most Wing Chun people do? They run. And the story is, Wong Jack Man turns around, he starts running, Bruce is punching him on the back of the head, and basically Wong Jack Man trips in the back of the school, and Bruce lands on top of him, and then holds up and it's going to punch him. And Bruce said he was very tired at that point, but he's on top. And Linda was the one who said, because Linda Lee was there at the fight, and she said at that moment, Bruce grabbed him and said, "Lei do you give up or do you not give up?" Which is very Canto slang, right? And the fact that Linda Lee even knew that phrase in Cantonese, because I doubt very highly that if Wong Jack Man said that to her husband, she would have remembered it. And so for me, that's kind of it. But if it turns out that Bruce Lee lost that fight, what is that like? I will go to sleep tonight, and I will still go on my day and do the things I need to do, right?
Yeah. I think this is such a great point to end off on, which is, guys, be careful who you idolize. Just remember, I'm a Christian, so I'm not going to spread that to people, but just remember, be wary of pedestalizing or idolize anyone, because we're all human, right? We're all of this world. So you're going to run into more problems than benefits if you idolize random people or random whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. And I think it's the flaws that make people great. We all have flaws. And if, the people who persevere despite having those flaws, those are the ones you look up to. Because imagine if someone had no flaws. Well, where was the struggle? And why is it so great to look up to them if they never faced any adversity, right?
Yeah.
It's the adversity that makes us strong.
Yeah, exactly. So, Alex, what is next on your channel? What are some upcoming episodes, maybe like in a week or 2 weeks, etc.?
So right now we're doing that kind of ask me anything format, because one, as a content provider, coming up with new, fresh content all the time, it's a lot of work, but people keep asking questions in the comments. So what we end up doing is we do these ask the genius. And so every week people ask more questions. So I have kind of a fresh stock of things to talk about. I just did a short series with one of my good friends, Dr. Kenneth J. He's a sport physiologist. The dude looks like Thor. I mean, he's like, when I'm next to him, I just look like a child. All right. And we reviewed movie training montages, and we review them, me from the Kung Fu perspective and him from the perspective of someone who actually knows what he's talking about, because he's a sports physiologist. And we did the first Drunken Master. And we analyzed like Jackie Chan's, like the wrist push-ups that he did and all that stuff. And I talk about it from the Kung Fu side. He literally breaks it down from a sports physiology perspective, whether those things are actually legit to train. And you'll be very surprised about what he has to say. We did No Retreat, No Surrender. And we also did, although it's not a Kung Fu movie, we did the Rocky IV montage, because that is just awesome. So I think we're going to do more of that stuff. So I'll have the long form podcast and then do some short things like that. Like the Kung Fu Genius, you know, talks about what I think about the Yip Man movie choreography, you know, that kind of stuff that people like on YouTube. So maybe more stuff like that.
I think that's awesome. I think that's something really great to look forward to. So yeah, for everyone that watches this, whether in fight commentary chats or whatever, I think I'm excited, and I think we're all excited for these movie breakdowns, these kind of training focus type of talks, because there's a lot of like stuff. Everyone's guilty of it. MMA people, traditional people, they're guilty of doing a lot of training wrong. You know, I'm not going to open up this rabbit hole, but how hard do you spar? You know, that's something that most people don't do right. Right?
Right.
How do you train your neck? Most people don't train their necks. I've talked to jiu-jitsu people. Jiu-jitsu people should really be training their necks and their upper backs all the time, because they're always imbalanced. But a lot of jiu-jitsu people don't train their necks, especially if you're a girl. A lot of girls are like, oh, I want a thin neck because I'm a girl. It's like, well, if you're going to do jiu-jitsu, you should probably not have a thin neck. I know aesthetically, but, you know, at least Jerry thinks thick necks are sexy on a girl or a guy. So take what
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I trained a little bit of jiu-jitsu with Magno and his guy. My neck always feels wrecked after that. And I'm like, I got to do more stuff for my neck just to be able to do jiu-jitsu in practice, let alone compete in it. Yeah,
exactly. So I think, Alex, we definitely need to do a follow-up, another talk soon, because there's so many things we can talk about. And for those of you watching, Alex from Kung Fu Genius, and I'll have a lot of links in the pinned comments so you guys can follow along some of the stuff we talked about. So Alex, thank you so much, man.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great. I had a great time. I look forward to doing it again.
Definitely.